welcome to episode 259 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I'm here with
Dylan Moore
and Nathan Smith.
And in today's episode, we will be talking about movies that we saw this week in part 1, and in part 2, we will be talking about the 1957 film Pyaasa. But quick notes before we get into the first part. We got some new reviews up on the website. Reed wrote about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which I know is not being talked about a lot online, so it's good that somebody's making the plunge to talk about it a little bit. Andrew talked about this film a bit last week, but his review of The Mountain, the new Rick Alverson film, is on the website, and he claims that he is the person to talk about this since it's a slow movie about masculinity, and he did a 40-minute essay about slow cinema and masculinity. So if that's the endorsement you want, there you go. And then finally, we have a review of Hobbs and Shaw by Logan Kinney, talking about how that fits into the Fast and Furious canon, and then reminisces a little bit on Missing Paul Walker. But as always, check those out on cinematary.com. We're going to have a new Film Theory and Chill coming up on the Patreon site, so if you've not signed up for that, please do and take part in that. It's going to be fun again. But let's go ahead and jump into movies that we saw this week. I wanted to kick it off with a relatively new release that's played a little bit around the country, has been kind of popping up in different places, and that is the documentary Amazing Grace. It's directed by Sidney Pollack. He had directed it in the 70s when the actual filming took place, and there was a lot of behind the scenes drama. Aretha Franklin, who is the subject of the documentary, did not want it aired, and so when she passed away recently, they put this thing back together and released it. But the documentary follows the recording of her best-selling gospel album Amazing Grace, which she records at a church in Los Angeles, and along with a church choir and the Reverend James Cleveland, who accompanies her on a number of songs. And it was kind of an interesting documentary for being like this. I was kind of thinking a lot about comparing it to the documentary concert film type hybrid that came out earlier this year, Homecoming by Beyonce, and the style of performance that both of these artists have. Homecoming, which possibly might be my favorite movie so far of this year, just has this like percussive motion the entire time. Beyonce always feels very in tune with the performers around her as well as the audience, and is kind of working off both of those all at the same time, and really kind of making this like one cohesive experience between all three of the parties kind of all working together. And Amazing Grace also has like this very communal for lack of a pun, religious effect to it, because you just completely become engrossed in like the performances that Aretha and the different performers are putting on. But Franklin is a much more like reserved performer, and so while the audience is still just engrossed kind of in her presence and the way that her voice is just capturing these songs in ways that they haven't heard before, she doesn't necessarily like engage with the audience like you see in something like in Beyonce's film Homecoming. She's very we talked about it with a group after the movie, and we were talking about whether she was just kind of reserved and away from the performance, or the way I read it was she was just much more like she was just focused. She was completely like clued in. I mean, it kind of reminded me of like an athlete where she didn't really wasn't engaged with any distractions. The only time really throughout the entire documentary you see her kind of break from this focus is when her father, who is also a reverend, comes up to the podium and talks a bit about her, talks about her early life before she takes part in another song. And then she finally kind of breaks this near the end, where she you have the Reverend James Cleveland speaking at the front, and Aretha has like this moment where, like, between the speech that Cleveland's making, she's like, she begins to like respond in song, which I feel like will be very relevant to the movie we talk about in part 2. But she like starts to kind of respond in song, and then breaks into this final piece where it's like she finally just loses all of the the anxiety and the focus that she's had for this performance probably for so long, and just completely lets loose and like engages with the church choir that's behind her, and finally like becomes a part of this celebration, this event that she's been the focal point of for the 2 days that they were filming and having this concert happen. And so it was just kind of an interesting experience. Aretha Franklin is this kind of figure that so many people have a relationship with because of her music and because of the impact that has. And kind of watching her, there's one sequence similar to Homecoming where it has this incredible match cut where it match cuts her singing this part of the song in the performance, and it match cuts to her singing, picking up that from that point in the song in the rehearsal. And you see a little bit of the behind the scenes of them setting this thing up, but not nearly as much as you do in Homecoming. And it's kind of, it's interesting to see this figure as this someone who, or at least just kind of the differences in performance, but at the same time, I feel like there's both eliciting the same reaction from the audience. The audience is just as engaged in both films, but it's interesting how they are reacting to these performers and how these two performers are using their gifts, whether it's in their kind of the physicality or it's in the way that they're singing, in order to work with this audience. So I would recommend seeing Amazing Grace if you're if you're an Aretha Franklin fan, or if you're just kind of interested in seeing this lost film. Sidney Pollack, it's really kind of fun to watch because you have the documentary crew of various cameras and such bouncing around the scene. It's not nearly as professional as something like Homecoming, where you don't see any cameras or any people who are like associated with the production. In this one, you constantly see like these cameramen having to kind of like squat in these strange positions to like get the shot, and it'll cut to like behind the choir and behind Aretha singing, and like you have this tower like within the church where the camera is like mounted up on it. It's kind of fun to see like this kind of almost DIY. I think this was the first really like documentary, like live filming that Sidney Pollack had done, and it's kind of fun to see it just for that element as well. But Amazing Grace, I believe it'll be streaming and available that way pretty soon, but I would recommend it. It's if you find a nice big TV with nice speakers and really just kind of suck it in.
Yeah, that was one of the movies this year that I felt bad if I was going to try to see it, not seeing it in theaters, right? Or, I mean, as you said, with the movie, it's trying to generate this communal experience, or at least document one. So it's like to then see it with a whole bunch of people feels a little bit more appropriate. But yeah, I mean, it still sounds like a good time if you're just trying to catch it as on a big screen as possible.
I mean, it's like any other concert film. Like, you want to watch it on this big screen because, I mean, if you're gonna watch like Stop Making Sense or something, you want to like watch it on this giant screen with these giant, really like feel the concert. And it seems to have generated kind of that, like that's what's been so crazy about this film, is it's generated this communal experience as the people watching this concert. Right. It's like multi layers, because somebody was telling me about how she went and saw it in a nearby town, like 30 minutes out of Savannah in South Carolina, and that when she went, they had like bussed women from black churches to the theater to catch this because it was only going to be there for the week, and that it was just like a packed house and everybody was singing along and crying and just becoming so engrossed in the concert. And it was somewhat of the same thing for this one. There weren't they weren't bringing in any people from black churches for this screening, but but it was a brand new theater in town. It was almost a packed house, and everybody was just kind of, sucked into just the majesty of the whole thing. It was seeing it on a big screen with a lot of people is worthwhile, and it's one of those experience films that, I don't know, people seem to miss out on, and it's a bummer.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine too, as a document from the 70s, that it still might get repertory screenings in the future.
Yeah, so. I hope so, because it does. It feels like this. It feels like the 70s film. It doesn't. It's not like one where they restored it and you kind of can feel the digital marks of it. It does feel. It's kind of like when Netflix put The Other Side of the Wind, the Orson Welles movie, out, where it's like this, 60s, 70s film that just pops out in 2018, 2019. It's kind of
something
neat.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I won't speak to the quality of The Other Side of the Wind or my perception of the quality, but it still has that aesthetic feel. Speaking to another movie I caught this weekend that actually was made in the 70s, so it feels like a 70s movie, is Dog Day Afternoon, the film by Sidney Lumet that stars Al Pacino. It's based on the true story of attempted bank robbers in Brooklyn. In the film, Al Pacino is Sonny, then John Cazale is Sal, and they attempt to rob this bank in Brooklyn at the kind of near the end of the day, like 5 o'clock as they're closing down. But it soon just slowly unravels. One of the members who had joined them on the bank heist flakes out right at the beginning, so he has to leave. The people within the bank are not situated correctly and are kind of questioning the planning behind Sonny and Sal's attempt to rob this bank. Sonny seems to have a knowledge of how banks work, but not necessarily how a heist works. There's this really entertaining sequence where they decide to finally put the bank tellers in the vault, and they're about to close the gate, the gate to the vault. But one of the women says, "Well, I can't be locked in here. I have to go to the bathroom." And so Al Pacino's like, "All right, well, fine, just go to the bathroom. Anybody else have to go?" And then 4 other ladies raise their hand. He's just like, "Well, it can't all go to the bathroom. That's not how this works." And just the ineptitude of them as they're trying to rob this bank is entertaining. And then you hit the point where they, answer the phone, look out the door, and just about every police officer in Brooklyn has surrounded the place. They've got on top of the roof of that building and across the building, and are now in this standoff, this hostage standoff with the police. And so for pretty much the rest of the movie, it's you jumping back and forth from a little bit from the cops across the street and how they're trying to bring Sonny out of the situation, and then Sonny and Sal within the bank and their interactions with the various tellers and such. And it was interesting that, getting a little bit of some context and backstory prior to watching the film. But of course, outside of this being based on a true story, an event that actually happened 3 years before this movie was made, you also had to have the context of the I'm gonna butcher, I think it's Alita, the prison killings.
Attica.
Attica, yeah. I knew it was there was some sort of double letter in it. Attica, where 41 prisoners were killed by police in New York, I think 4 or 5 years prior to the movie coming out. And so that becomes kind of a touch point of Sonny's battle with the cops. And another movie where you're watching the crowd kind of engage with this, because it is there is this he's acting the movie, but there's this performance value in Al Pacino performing as Sonny whenever he leaves the bank and is engaging with the cops, and the way he works the crowd and the crowd works both with him and against him is just really engaging and entertaining, and kind of you have these lulls where you're dealing more with the characters kind of interacting with one another, and then they pull you outside somehow, and there's all these different factors once you exit the building that just kind of add to the heightened tension of the film. I really enjoyed it though. It's like this really incredibly progressive movie in terms of its gender politics and the way it's looking at sexuality. I mean, this is 1975, and you later learn that Sonny is trying to rob this bank in order to pay for his as he tells him, his wife, but it is his male partner, played by Chris Sarandon, who is trying to get a sex change, but can't pay for the surgery. And so that plot line enters later in the film, and it's interesting how the crowd reacts to learning that information, but how it also brings this other group of allyship to Sonny's cause. I don't know. It's a movie that 1975 still plays really well currently. I mean, have any of you seen this recently or seen it before?
Yeah, I've seen it a couple times. Yeah. To that scene that you're speaking of, I mean, the movie even like sets it up as an intentional confusion. I mean, because we meet his wife before we find out he has, the male partner that he was actually asking the police for, or to get on the phone to get him down there. And so, I mean, like, it puts the audience in suspense, and then, once we figure it out, it's like, because some of it changes the POV of like who the audience is trying to follow or what we're following, because it goes from that into the one like police chief or whoever that's down there that's trying to actually like help Sonny, right, and Sal get through the experience. But that's an interesting thing that comes out of a movie from 75. And kind of gets the audience involved and like, oh, you see what you thought? You assumed something, didn't you? Like, oh, yeah, you're right.
Well, and it's interesting also because you can kind of tell the for lack of a better word, uncomfortableness that the police officers have when they learn like what he's trying to get the money for, but you also see that they find this to be their en route into solving the situation. It's kind of watching that thought process go through their faces. It was kind of entertaining in itself. I think you hear like one officer kind of in the back say something about like, oh, he's queer, but you would think that there'd be this whole tide turn, but it's kind of interesting to see them try to rationalize in term, even though they're internally kind of feeling differently. But yeah, Dog Day Afternoon. I don't know necessarily if it's streaming anywhere. I caught it in a theater, but yeah, I would recommend checking it out if you have not.
It's a good summer movie while it's still hot outside.
It's a great summer movie. I think Ash wrote about it for our Sweaty Movies canon. Okay. So
right. Yes.
There you go. But I'm going to toss it over to Nathan, who has a movie to talk about.
Yeah, I didn't really watch many movies this week, but I did watch the 1968 Italian spaghetti Western, The Great Silence, directed by Sergio Corbucci, who's perhaps best known for his movie Django, which of course inspired a lot of other movies all named Django or about characters named Django, including Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained. This film, The Great Silence, was also a big influence on Tarantino. The snowy look of the Hateful Eight is really kind of taken from this film, which, unlike a lot of the other spaghetti westerns, the term that we used to refer to that cycle of westerns produced in Italy and generally filmed in Spain, this movie was not filmed in Spain, even though it is, it falls in the cycle. It was filmed in the kind of southern part of the Alps in northeast Italy, the Dolomites. So this really looks very, very different from just like generally any Western that you have seen, I have seen, but also, looks very different from the Sergio Leone movies, and a lot of the other, popular spaghetti westerns. Those movies are very dry and arid and rugged, and this is a very cold, unfeeling movie, a very unsparing, violent movie, and so that landscape, from the beginning, seeing this just dark figure in this white, endless, supposed to be Utah landscape is just, I think, like it's grabs your attention because it kind of upends your expectations of what a Western is. Because even though, the Western United States is this vast landscape, we do sort of, I think, have a certain kind of place in mind when we talk about Westerns. You have this sort of like kind of badlands like Chimney Rock, big sort of formations, the endless sky of John Ford movies. But this is a movie very much of its time, I feel, very much of 1968, allegedly inspired by the assassinations of Che Guevara and Malcolm X. So, it I think is of a piece with films, like Bonnie and Clyde, The Wild Bunch, the ends of Easy Rider, Night of the Living Dead. All of these movies end with these sort of like really nihilistic, just like tear the movie to shreds kind of brutal scenes of violence where the main characters are gunned down. This is like very much also sort of in that mode. It's a real downer of a movie, and a movie that was meddled with by the producers, that had a sort of difficult release in the United States, that offended Darryl F. Zanuck when it was screened for him, and which led 20th Century Fox to refuse to distribute the movie in the U.S., though they did distribute it outside of the U.S. So this is and this movie is in Italian, but it was released in an English dub and a German dub, and it was just restored 2 years ago in a 4K restoration and was released by Film Movement. I caught it on Canopy, where it was streaming. So basically, to get to the story of this, so I have all this context, but to get to the story of this, basically, The Great Silence refers to the protagonist of this movie, who is this lone drifter named Silence, who, when he was a child, his parents were murdered by this corrupt banker named Henry Pollicut, and his throat was slit, so he's mute. He's been mute pretty much his whole life. But he's sort of roaming across the landscape trying to enforce some sense of justice in this hard, cold world. And so he comes back years later in 1898 in the middle of a blizzard to the town that he's from in Utah, to the town of Snow Hill. Because of the blizzard, everybody in the town, who for the most part are pretty poor, they have to steal to survive. And this same corrupt banker, Henry Pollicut, who killed Silence's parents and made him mute, has put a bounty on the heads of everyone in the town, pretty much, who steals, which is everyone. So this roving gang of bounty hunters led by Klaus Kinski, come to town and make their way gunning down, just like families and, just normal people. So there's just like, just from the jump, that this is kind of unlike any other Western, just because usually, at least in American Westerns, the violence is restricted to some strata of society, like it's between criminals, or it's between law and order and disorder, it's very sort of clear opposing sides, and there are certain people who do violence, and there are certain people who, are threatened by violence, but who are ultimately rescued from it and not, subject to violence. In this movie, anyone and everyone can be hurt, maimed, killed, tortured. It's really just sort of like opening the field wide for like anything and everything. So this guy Silence is hired by a woman named Pauline, whose husband has been murdered, and she hopes that Silence will be able to kill Klavskinski and his gang. But Pauline and Silence fall in love. He's mute, obviously, so she's doing all the talking. But they have a very steamy romance, which is rare for for the genre in general, but especially rare for Corbucci, and was actually like the only love scene that he filmed in his entire career, supposedly, at least in the westerns. I have not seen all of his films, so I will not verify that statement or stand by it. But supposedly, in something that I read, that's what he said. But it's even more interesting because Pauline is, I think, the only person in this town who's black. So not only, is it a love scene between a mute man and a woman who can speak, it's an interracial love scene. So sort of, very, very, a movie that is concerned, I think, with like the radical politics of the time and the efforts of the state and of capital to thwart radical politics. But it's also a very progressive movie in its romance and the character relationships. So, I was, just as a kind of brief aside, while watching this movie, I started watching this movie, just knowing this film by reputation. I didn't really know much about the plot, but my ears sort of perked up when I found out that it took place in Utah at the end of the 19th century, because I think, as I probably mentioned on the podcast before, I grew up Mormon, so just kind of hearing that this is sort of in that world, in that milieu, was very interesting to me, and I was kind of waiting to see if there would maybe be any allusions to the characters' religious beliefs or anything like that. This being an Italian movie, I figured that probably wouldn't happen, though according to the Wikipedia page, in the English dub, they actually change some things a little bit, so it kind of alludes to the fact that the characters are being killed not just because they're poor and have to steal food to survive, but also because they're Mormon. And so just considering like the very brutal massacre that ends this movie, and the kind of like history of violence against Mormons in American history that the American government engaged in, even that people don't really talk about, that was just like kind of hit hard for me watching that. But it is a really, I think, really unlike any other Western I've seen, a really shocking movie, a really daring movie. It has this very sort of dreamy, flashback, fantastical kind of like murky quality to it. It almost reminded me in a sense of kind of like doing to the Western what John Boorman's Point Blank from 1967 kind of does for the sort of, thriller sort of detective movie, because that is a sort of very movie with a kind of very jagged sense of editing. You have these sort of flashbacks butting in and disrupting the reality of the movie and sort of making you uncomfortable, and detectives and action heroes are supposed to give you this sense of control and security, but that movie is all about disrupting that, and this movie is sort of doing that, I think, with like cowboys and sort of Western heroes, of just sort of like destabilizing the sense of security and control that those heroes offer us. Because in the end of this movie, all the heroes die. It's just this total is like, it's all just capital. It's this movie very clearly links violence and profit motive. Every murder in this movie is a transaction and money earned in somebody's pocket. So I think it's just like really fascinating and radical in that regard. And just a very beautiful movie to boot. So Quentin Tarantino got it right. He's got some good taste sometimes. He knows how to pick them. This is I think a great movie, and a movie that I'm excited to revisit in the future.
The two other movies that kind of reminds me of is Day of the Outlaw that came out in the 50s. That was like really snowy. Yeah. Like at a certain point, I mean, the frame up of the movie is like people rob banks and then get kind of shut out into this kind of Blizzard ghost town, or what, there's like very few people there, but yet they're having to confront the town people who live there. And it gets really intense in like a bottle episode of a TV show or something like that, where it's like it's all just going to go to a boil because they all can't really escape from one another. And so that kind of Blizzard setting generates that kind of thing, right? But I was surprised because that was from the 50s, and it's like, as you say, an uncommon setting for a Western to have to deal with. And so that, or like something like the second half of McCabe and Mrs. Miller, where it gets like really snowy and depressing.
It does remind me a little bit of McCabe, just because you have this sort of like crumbling, decrepit town, verging on ghost town, basically, where it's just like muddy and everybody's just like having a miserable time.
So at least Day of the Outlaw, what it does different, it sounds like, compared to the real kind of dreamy qualities that Great Silence does, and what ultimately is kind of like a tone that Altman plays in McCabe and Mrs. Miller, is like there's a weird like theatrical quality to Day of the Outlaw, where it's like it'll sit the camera back and you're just kind of absorbing this space, and there's like, it just feels like uncomfortable and dangerous. You can't really get that dreaminess from it. You just kind of like, you want the people to be able to leave because at least in the middle part of the movie, they're all kind of stuck in this kind of bar, setting. So it gets really uncomfortable as basically authority shifts sides when the bank robbers show up. So, but cool. Yeah, I want to check out The Great Silence. That sounds interesting. So you said the only place that you had seen it was on Canopy. Anywhere else?
I don't know about streaming. I mean, I know there's a Blu-ray, that's out. That's came out last year, I believe. So it's around. The local library. Film Movement is a label that a lot of libraries and stuff get. So I feel like it's within reach.
How is Klaus Kinski in that movie? Did he do anything for you?
He's good, but he's a little bit more of a kind of marginal presence, and I mean, he is like the main villain, but he is. I do feel like in terms of like on a scale of 1 to Klaus Kinski, like he is actually somewhat more toned down, and he's still like, actually I feel like this is maybe like the earliest movie that I've seen him in.
I was about to say,
because he does still look like pretty young and like less haggard, so that was kind of interesting, just seeing he have this like sort of youthful sort of gleam in his eye, which makes him like a little just even more sinister almost, just because he's not like, oh haha, like that crazy Klaus Kinski. He's like still kind of a human being a little bit, and so it just really, like, honestly, like you really kind of like feel the like Nazi in him, just because it's like he's this more youthful guy with floppy hair, and so you just can kind of like see that character as a like goose stepper, so I think that like maybe there's something of that kind of, honestly, probably reading in this movie too, of just this like literal Holocaust that happens in this movie. So yeah. Anyways.
Brutal movie. brutal movie. Well, let's wrap up with, I'm sure, a much lighter movie. Take it away, Dylan.
Yeah, considering. So I saw a Buster Keaton movie. I caught it on YouTube because, at a certain point, copyright gets pretty loose. So you can check it out there. Go West. It came out in 1925. I think it's like Buster Keaton's third feature that he directed by himself. Because, it's like either it's Ernest Cline or whoever else that he ends up teaming up with. But basically, him as Buster doing his own stunts, more or less directs himself, it seems like. But funny considering that we're just talking about a Western. This goes in kind of the opposite direction of Keaton playing a character more or less called Friendless, where he leaves New York. He's like, the first shot we see of him is like he's leaving a house with all what seems like all of his stuff in like a cart, and he immediately goes to a pawn shop or a store to like trade it for whatever he can. And outside of the ridiculous banter he has with the storekeeper or whatever, that he only ends up with like a picture of his mother that he has to buy back from him, and just like a loaf of bread and a sausage or whatever to get him out on the road. And he just train hops for a long time until he ends up out west, and whatever. It of course opens up with that. Was it Graham Greene? No, what's that guy's name? I can never remember. That Horace Greeley, right? The guy says, "Go west, young man." That thing. So that's like, there's like this weird, I can't, because it kind of makes fun of it ultimately, but it's like a weird statuesque opening where it's just like filmed in like a black background with a statue of Horace Greeley, like pointing out frame right with the quote more or less from him. But so like he ends up going there, and it just, imagine Buster trying to fit and be a cowboy out in the West. And that's kind of like the vast majority of the movie. And he earns his name or his moniker from this pretty clearly, because basically like he has whatever, his normal or city clothes on. But as soon as he gets there, like some cattle hands were ranch hands that were leaving, and he just like snags some of their clothes and puts it on and just like wanders up while like kind of inspecting the ranch hands. That like, this is how you be a cowboy. And he immediately like assumes this kind of bow-legged stance to just wander up to the ranch owner to like ask for a job. And he immediately like falls on his ass because it's awkward and he's not used to doing it. But more or less like he needs help, or the rancher does. And it's like, yeah, sure, whatever, go milk this cow. And of course he's inept at it, and it keeps going like that for a while, of him just not fitting in, not being a cowboy, until at a certain point he ends up making a friend with a cow named Brown Eyes that ends up saving him from a bull attack. And really, it's a weirdly sweet connection that the movie makes, and ultimately where the movie goes is this great madcap. Everybody has to help get the stockyard of cattle into Los Angeles to sell, or the rancher will be out of business. And of course, there's a rival rancher or whatever. It's like, you can't sell these cattle yet, you're going to screw me over. And so all the ranch hands get like shooed away off the train, and Buster is the only one that can, corral the cattle through the streets of Los Angeles. And he does it by himself, and he doesn't know how to do it properly. So he just literally goes through the streets of Los Angeles and disrupts literally everybody's shit. So it's like, they all go every which way, end up into like clothing stores and like movie shops. And it's madness. And like, really at a certain point, this movie is great to watch just for them to try to figure it out. And that, of course, the cops like just slowly dawn on him, like dawn on the cops what exactly is going on. And they all get pissed off at Buster and chase after him. And, earlier on, Buster learns the main way to get a bull to like steer them and get them to go to where they want is to have red on, right? So it has that conceit to it. And the only thing that was big enough to like corral all the cattle down the road is that in a costume shop that he's like also getting the cattle out. It's like, do you have anything red? And the only thing he finds after all the people that are in the store freak out because, there's some bull that just kind of wandering in all haphazard and unsure where they are. So is a demon costume that's all red, and that at a certain point in the movie he is running around down the streets of LA in a pointy horned tail demon costume that's all red, that with bulls chasing after him with like a trail of cops just holding on to him, trying to like slow him down and actually figure out what's going on. So man, it's a fun mess of a movie towards the end. So would recommend it, and it's easy to recommend because it's on YouTube. So so there you go, 1925, and it's only like 69 minutes, solid 70. It's like
Nice.
Easy to watch. Yep. Thank you, Nathan. So yeah, it's a good one.
No, he usually doesn't. We're gonna take a short break.
You can watch it. I'd suggest playing the Pet Shop Boys version of Go West on repeat over the entirety of the movie.
That'll be good. Definitely change the tone in a good way.
We're going to take a quick break. We will be back in part 2 talking about Pyaasa after this.
Hey, Cinematary listeners. Andrew here. During this break in the show, I'd like to mention that Cinematary does want your money. You can give us your money at patreon.com/cinematary, where you can chip in a small fee of about $5 a month, the price of a fancy coffee, in exchange for shout outs in every episode, the opportunity to choose movies we cover on the show, and bonus episodes every month in which we talk about more movies as well as other miscellaneous stuff. In the past, we've just been humbly asking for you to share the show and engage with us, and we would still love for you to do those things. You can tweet us at Cinematary, send us an email, zach@cinematary.com, leave us a review on iTunes, all that stuff. But Cinematary has grown a ton in the past few years due to the hard work of a bunch of writers, myself included, who haven't been paid for their labor, which is sadly a pretty normal thing. We record things and write things for free, you listen to and read them for free, and the only people getting paid are like Apple and Google, which is depressing. So, if you appreciate what we do, if you feel like there's some sort of value being exchanged here and you'd like more of it, help us normalize paying people by going to patreon.com/cinematary and chipping in $5 a month. We would truly appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Now let's get back to the show.
आँखों में इस दिल को बसा दे तो हम मूंद के पलकों को इस दिल को सजा दे तो हम आपकी आँखों में.
And we are back with part 2 of episode 259 of Cinematary. In this part, we will be continuing our Young Critics Watch Old Movies series with 1957's Pyaasa. The film is directed and stars Guru Dutt from a script by Abrar Alvi. The film also stars Wahida Rehman, Mala Sinha, and Johnny Walker. Easiest name in the entire sheet we got here. Vijay, who's played by Guru Dutt, writes unpopular poems about the destitute and poor. Ridiculed by his brothers and scorned by publishers, Vijay finds encouragement in a sweet prostitute, Gulabo. When a homeless man wearing a coat Vijay gave him is killed, Gulabo convinces the publisher to print his poems, believing Vijay to be dead. The poems are widely popular thanks to the myth conjured around his supposed death. When he reappears, he finds that few friends can be trusted. With the commercial success of thrillers such as Bazi, Jal, Arpar, and CID, as well as his comedies such as Mr. and Mrs. 55, Guru Dutt and his studio were financially secure and established at this point, and so from 1957 on, he could make just about any movie he wanted to make, including this one. In the original ending, Guru Dutt wanted to show that Vijay left the place all alone, but on the distributor's insistence, the ending was changed. The film was originally titled Pyaasa, which means thirst, but Guru Dutt later changed it to Pyaasa, which means the thirsters, to better describe the film. It really cleared it up for me. Guru Dutt wanted to film red light area scenes on location in Calcutta, but the crew was attacked by a group of pimps, so unable to film then, he recreated sets on the basis of photos that they took in Calcutta. It is also surmised the story of the film is based on the life of the film's lyricist Sahir Ludhianvi, who had a failed affair with poet and writer Amrita Pritam. Pyaasa marked the last collaboration of the long-lasting team of composer S.D. Burman and the lyricist Sahir Ludhianvi. One of the songs that S.D. Burman composed for the film was based on a tune from the British movie Harry Black, which was later released in India as Harry Black and the Tiger. Burman was initially not happy. He wasn't happy about copying a Western tune, quote, but later changed it so well that when the producer of Harry Black and the Tiger visited India, he heard the song and not only failed to recognize the tune, but commended Dada on it. After a slow opening, Pyaasa went on to be a major commercial success of that year. It gave Guru Dutt the confidence to make a repeat on a grand scale. However, his film Kagaz Ke Phool went on to be a commercial disaster. The movie picked up a cult following in the 80s, long after the director had died. Wahida Raymond's character in Pyaasa was based on a real-life character. Abrar Alvi and his friends were visiting Bombay, and they decided to visit the red light area. Alvi got talking to a girl who called herself Gulabo. According to Alvi, quote, "As I left, she thanked me in a broken voice, saying that it was the first time that she had been treated with respect in a place where she heard only abuses. I used her exact words in the film." In 2015, looking back at the film, the Huffington Post India said, more than 50 years later, Pyaasa continues to remain a formidable work of cinema that presents the art of filmmaking at its finest. The movie fulfills in its absolute sense the real purpose of cinema, to entertain and educate simultaneously. In 2010, Time magazine listed the film among the best movies of all time, saying the writer, producer, director, star paints a glamorous portrait of an artist's isolation through dappled imagery and the sensitive picturizing of S.D. Burman's famous songs. And Raymond, in her screen debut, is sultry, radiant, a woman to bring out the poet in any man on screen or in the audience. On that note, let's talk a little bit about Pyaasa, which was a film that I think I talked a little bit about last week at the end. Was kind of excited to see. I'm a big fan of Satyajit Ray and his films, but at the same time, his output is kind of a small portion of what Indian cinema is classified as. I mean, he's more of the art cinema, while especially even at this time when Guru Dutt was working, the much more popular, you had this kind of Western influence that would later kind of form into the Bollywood film. I know this one is kind of looked at as a classic Bollywood film, but at this point, this is kind of in the midst of the 1950s, which seemed to be India's golden age for movies, and this one really blew me away. I kind of was struggling a little bit to get interest in it, kind of during the first act, but whenever it switches and he dies but doesn't die, I think the movie takes it to this whole different level. But I'm curious what you all made of Pyaasa. I was really struck by a lot of the sequences in this movie, and really taken, had kind of my breath taken away by some of the images in this film. It's sort of I don't know, it's just, I don't remember where I heard this, maybe in some class or something, or maybe I read it somewhere, but I remember once hearing somebody talk about, kind of, in Bollywood cinema, you can't really talk about musicals in the same way that you can in American cinema, just because, every film, pretty much every Bollywood film, has the musical sequences built into it. That's just the kind of the overarching sort of language of the industry. But, this is a very, odd, I think, mixture of genres, because you have these musical sequences which are often very dreamlike and sort of separate from the kind of the filmic reality in some way. They seem to take place in another time or some other space, but it's also, before we started recording,
Dylan, you said that this was kind of like a noir musical, noir melodrama, which I think is really true. It's like it's not really a mystery, but it is in a way, at least, in the last part of the film, it sort of becomes that a little bit. But there's something sort of like, I don't know, there's like a weird sort of, like there's something about noir movies that you can't really quite like get your fingers around. Like it's, it's kind of like Smoke or something, and there's something about this movie that feels like that to me, where it's like, it's just this sort of like slippery thing, it's like, it's romantic, but has this sort of strange comic relief too, very melodramatic, very, has this sort of noirish quality, but also these musical sequences, and sometimes it's almost like neo-realist, but other times it's like totally surreal. So that was just what really struck me, is just like all of the tendencies going on in this movie.
Yeah, I'll bounce off that too. That to that point then about noir, because at least earlier on, or what was trying to be captured a lot in noir was, life on the streets kind of thing, right? Actually taking the camera outside and making it more of like a realist kind of thing. But ultimately what a lot of noir ends up doing is making this weird heightened version of reality where there's all these really dark spaces and everybody's smoking, and it all is just kind of in this, tense space that they're conjuring up. And so, in this one, you kind of have this, to me, what feels similar to like a noir cinematography, where like anytime it's on like dude's face, there's like a way that they're like conjuring shadows across it. Like it like falls off. There's like real high contrast, and it's just this like, it kind of feels like a noir movie, and it feels kind of scary in that way, where everybody's just kind of unless you're more like at a dinner party scene, which we can talk about later, that there's these spaces that this guy who's more or less without a home is wandering through and trying to deal with and figure out why all this is happening. And at that point, being a poet. And so, and like with a lot of noir too, but in this case, as you say, Nathan, that it just touches on so many tones that noir wouldn't even touch sometimes, that it's like, it's a kind of melancholy and a kind of funny, and and it's all of those things in ones, but then also can break in musical numbers, which, as far as I know, no self-serious noir would try to make musical numbers in the middle of it. So that's makes it, at least from an American film spectator from the outside, it feels like a special mixture, special thing.
And and even kind of like for me, it feels like a sort of meta genre almost, where it sort of feels like almost this movie sort of feels kind of like a religious parable almost, at least the sort of ending where he becomes, everybody thinks Vijay is dead. His poems are published and become very successful because of this myth that grows up around him. Or, everybody's saying, I knew Vijay, I knew Vijay. And when he comes back and he finally convinces everyone that he's Vijay and they accept him, like he realizes, that this is just like all of, like, these people aren't actually interested in what his poetry was saying. They're just like interested in being close to his success, trying to like capture some of whatever he has. So he just like totally rejects them and goes off, leaves, like, I don't know, goes away.
Yeah, you could say.
But, it almost feels like this sort of like, I don't know, like the Buddha, like rejecting his, earthly possessions or something. Like it just sort of has this very like, there's a sort of like morality here that feels, like, like it's like there's something like mythic to this story, it almost feels like it kind of takes place to me at least, it felt like it almost took place like beyond kind of like time, almost like it sort of felt like it could have taken place in just this sort of totally imagined world.
And to that point of what Zach brought up about, in that case, they were actually going to try to film in a red light district, but they got kicked out. But most of the movie, this is a weird comparison, but or not really, but it's like a one from the heart, right? Like where it's all these like reconstructed sets that can like make it feel real, but at the same time, if you catch the peripheries of it, you can feel that it's a constructed set that they built. And I don't know, there's something that I think can help build its either timeless or parable or even dreamlike quality, even after it's like capturing bits of I guess truth on some level.
I know at the beginning you were talking about it's difficult to talk about like Bollywood compared to American musicals. But I think that there is somewhat, at least in this version, there is kind of this Western influence to it in terms of, as you've been describing some of the musical sequences. I mean, like the fantasy element reminds you of something in like a Fred Astaire movie, they almost kind of mock what that looks like in that one sequence in Singing in the Rain, when you have like the whole break where Gene Kelly is just going off on this long sequence that almost derails the whole plot of the movie. And so it kind of has this Western influence where you can see the, that Guru Dutt is familiar with what Hollywood is doing, but at the same time I agree with you, Nathan, that it has this like mystical quality to it, so that even though there is kind of this like almost silly melodrama at parts. I mean, there's that one sequence at the party where he's like sad and like he overcomes his sadness and just starts like singing his poem while after listening to the other two poets who sing their crap. And but there's something so convincing and so I don't know if it's Guru Dutt's performance or the way that he just kind of frames his character in this, but it doesn't come off as hokey or silly. I don't know. Did you guys see kind of that Western influence in the musical numbers?
Well, one thing that I felt like, I don't know if this was how it felt to you guys, but one thing that I felt like maybe set this apart from some musical, American musicals, is that I felt like some of this musical sequences were a lot longer than I was used to. I don't know if that was like just my perception of them, but for some reason they felt like much more extended than I feel like I'm really used to, or at least in some way they felt like more separate from like the rest of the space that the movie is set in. There's that I'm having a hard time remembering exactly where in the movie it was, but there's like that one musical number where like he's in a tux and like it's this sort of dream sequence, and I just felt like every time I don't know, I feel like in a lot of at least Hollywood musicals there's sometimes more of an attempt to weave the song like into the kind of main continuous narrative space, aside from something like the end of an American in Paris, where it's just like a crazy fantastical sequence, or the Broadway melody sequence in Singing in the Rain. But I just felt like a little more separation between like those worlds, except for like when he starts singing, in public, for the like crowd or something.
Yeah. So is that sequence that you're talking about the one after he meets up with that girl he met at school?
Yeah.
And it's like a daydream. The bit's almost funny after it ends. It's like this motherfucker is daydreaming over here about the girl that he's sitting next to, and then he wakes up, she's gone, and it's just like, oh no, what's happening? But yeah, no, that's a very as you say, just like a separate out from the rest of the reality of the movie, because it's like all these curtains and like balloons, and they're all just kind of dancing. But it's sad too, because if this is this guy's daydream and it's about the girl Minna like teasing him, or like saying it's like, you can keep presenting me your heart, but I'll just ignore it and walk away. And that's kind of being the crux of that. And then of course, he snaps out of his daydream or whatever, and she's gone and left the note. It's, I don't know. It's a heck of a sequence, even if.
I guess maybe the thing is like sometimes the musical sequences themselves aren't that maybe necessarily like different from something in an American musical, but it's just maybe like what the contrast between those sequences and the rest of the movie that makes them feel very different. Because like, for example, in this movie, like that the sequence where he runs into this like extremely emaciated homeless guy, gives him his jacket with the poem inside, and then the guy runs after him and gets hit by the train. Just like, there would never be someone who looked like that in an American movie. If like it would be this probably just like friendly, charming, like little homeless guy, and he would also not die probably in this brutal way like that. It would probably just be this like sweet little sequence where where toothless Dick Van Dyke like shows up and like sings a little song about like keeping your head up or something. But it's just there's like this like extremely melodramatic and like intense melodramatic contrast between the like highs of this movie and the lows, and it's just willingness to show like extreme poverty and to show these just like depressed, dejected, starving people is like so different from particularly American musicals, which are like the dream factory par excellence. The like epitome of escapist cinema is MGM, golden age Hollywood musicals. There are elements of that in here, but it's used to such different effect, to this almost like, Brechtian like social commentary effect, where it's like the fantasy of the musical sequences is just to point out how dire the rest of the world is.
Right. I mean, almost to your point about like it being in this kind of I don't want to say a meta movie in that way, but it's dealing with that tension of both of those feelings at once, right? I mean, like all the poetry and the music that informs the set pieces of the movie end up talking a lot about that. I mean, to the point that like it kind of feels weird when it can separate itself out from the people talking as they normally do in kind of a atonal way, and then kind of falling into a musical. But it kind of in each different set pieces they kind of get into it in different ways. So like a specific one I'm thinking about is I guess just guys reciting poetry at this party at the where he ends up getting a job at one point, that we find out it's Minna's husband who got him the job at this publishing company as an assistant. And he shows up and gets humiliated by, it's like, he doesn't really want them there as a party guest, but as a servant to serve tea. And there's poets there that just start reciting lines to the, oh, wow, that's wonderful, please do more crowd that's around. I couldn't tell if that's like they meant it or if they're just kind of being a little obsequious. I couldn't really tell. And so at one point, like he's Gurudut's character is like on the periphery of the party and just starts reciting lines. I mean, and the poets end up backing him up, basically saying, it's not just a privileged rich person's a prerogative to learn and recite poetry, that it's even the servants, that kind of thing. And so, and that's one of the two sequences that like makes this distance connection with Minna, because everybody else kind of hears this as really powerful, pleasant poetry, but it's just like really every time he recites something, she just like falls to shreds, right? And it's always like a silent weeping. And I don't know. I mean, I guess that the specific point being that it's the movie is able to get into these musical, like high, what we'd consider even like melodramatic moments from like different vectors, right? It could even start like as something as like just reciting poetry at a party versus, the masseuse, basically providing his own jingle while he's saying it's like, come to me, I'll rub your head. And it's, well, I got oils, I got machine oils and things like that. And it's just,
I mean, it is, to think about, to place this movie in historical context, being set and made not too long after India's independence from Great Britain. It does, it really asks this question of kind of like, in this new democratic society, like, what is the social value of art? What good is art? What purpose does it have? And it's interesting because in the filmmaking of the movie itself, in the form of the movie, I feel like what it says is basically what VJ says, of like, this is for everyone, this is not just, this can be, the flowery, the depictions of nature and love and whatnot, but it also has this social value and can reveal ills and shed light on, the problems in society. And that's, in the movie, poetry has this, we see those different functions of poetry. Like you say, we also see, poem as jingle, as this sort of commercial thing, that has a role in the marketplace. And I think that, with the different types of musical sequences that you have here, with these, like, the really heart-wrenching number that ends the movie, where you see this crowd of people and you hear basically VJ singing this monologue of him, like, realizing that he doesn't love this world anymore, that he doesn't feel connected to this world, and like he's not going to do anything for it. So I feel like in the form of the movie, it's very like, yes, art can have a good, contribute good to society, but it's weird because I feel like in the actual story is kind of like, as much as I was really taken with like a lot of the images in this movie and a lot of the filmmaking, the story kind of like didn't sit quite right with me, because the ending sort of almost feels like, this like Eisenstein movie with like, all of the like, the crowd and like all the fists and like all these bodies, but it's just this like total rejection of like the collective as a complete kind of mob. And instead of saying like, let's like, stay in society and try to like build it up and make it better, it's just totally rejecting that and saying like, we need to leave the mass and the crowd, the unruly mob who are not good enough to understand our poetry, and we need to get out of Dodge and like go start over, just Adam and Eve style. So like, I don't know, it's just like an odd tension, because it feels like like it's in the form again of like very democratic, like art does have value, but then the story is just such like, so almost like nihilistic, just like such a downer.
Yeah, from the beginning to the end of the movie, it opens right with VJ just appreciating nature, right? Like he's just hanging out in a park somewhere, just kind of like taking in the trees and some birds flying, and like watches a bee as it goes around pollinating. And the bee lands, and VJ's still watching, and just some person just steps right on the bee, and that kind of like sets the kind of, at least the tone for where some of it follows, right?
That's the lexicon of the entire film.
Well, to that point, it's like, when we find out he's a poet and then he's going to sell his poetry to this publisher, that's just like, why don't you talk about flowers and, all the good stuff and ladies' curves and whatever else? And it's like, I guess I could, but, these other things. And, so you probably don't want me to talk about that dude just stomping the hell out of that bee, huh? That's probably not what you want. But no, that's a really interesting tension that you bring up by the end. And as you say, I'm not sure that the movie does much to resolve it, because it almost frames it as like an abstaining version of like, well, I just need to go out and see what the rest of the world is, or just be by myself. And I guess that, I don't know how they would actually emotionally resolve the conflict of the movie, because it's kind of sets out of him being rejected by most of his family except his mom, and then he feels conflicted about his mom later on when she passes away, and he wasn't there and didn't even hear about it until their brothers go to like a river and mourn for her, like at least go through the rites, and he has to ask what they're there for. And as we kind of hinted at by the end, like he ends up getting in that publishing deal with that guy posthumously, or what is presumed after he gets hit by that train, because of what's her name, Gulab. I think it changes depending on who's talking to her. I think it's Galabo or Gulab, depending. But like she shows up, I mean, and she means it in full earnestness of like, I really love his poetry, and I think it should get published. But then it sets off this chain of events of, I mean, the husband, the guy, the Modern Publishing Company or whatever, like already seems like he wants to humiliate VJ and hates his guts because like he has his wife's attention even after Minna and him get married, and is just super jealous about it, and you know, even like giving him a job, but then ultimately humiliating him in so many ways. And so the final, I guess, humiliation, or at least part of the movie hints at, is him just running wild with his poetry, right? Like publishing his book, yeah, that's fine, but then just making massive amounts of profit off of it, and just setting up the cult of this guy's image after he's dead. And I mean, even to the point, like it gets so depressing that him and who's ever supposed to be this VJ's best friend or whatever that we see a couple times that he shows up at his house. I don't want to say best friend, whatever, a friend that you know, they visit him at a sane asylum, and there's like, no, that's not him, because they're still making money off of him, right? So it's like they don't want to like admit that he's still alive, because as soon as he shows back up, then they can't easily make a profit off of his image anymore, right? Because it like completely changes the dynamic. And it's only until you know, the masseuse, the guy that goes around trying to relax people from their daily woes by giving them a massage, like finally sees him there and helps him like escape, that then the rest of the movie plays out to where not only does he feel alienated as he was before, but now he is entirely not who he is because of this image of this dead poet who's, you know, talking about the woes of society. But everybody knows this poet and the name, but like there's this one sequence where they're like on this trolley car, right? And this one guy's talking about how great of a poet this guy is, and that, he totally knew him when he was still alive, and that he actually came to him with advice a couple times. But, you know, lo and behold, of course, that he's actually standing next to VJ himself, the poet, and he just does not know who that guy is, and is actually in the way of him talking to somebody who's across the trolley. And it's that whole thing that leads into the final sequence of him basically saying, burn it down, right? Like, I don't know this society anymore, and if this is what this is, I don't know. I don't want it to call it mine, because it's not. I mean, so I guess it doesn't, or maybe it couldn't really, or they, Guderdut and the screenwriters working on the movie couldn't find a way to get it to a happier place, right? It's just kind of.
They were like, we're not working on that level. We're singing pain. Right.
We're singing pain, right. I mean, it's so right. Like just about every musical sequence outside of, you know, the comic relief with the masseuse, Abdul, that is generally a sorrowful tone, right? Because I mean, another sequence that is just like so is the first sequence of him seeing Minna for the first time again after I think seeing at her from a distance that got her to start thinking about her again. Is some college reunion thing that one of their classmates ropes him into and throws him up on the stage to recite poetry because somebody ditches at the last minute or just doesn't show up to do it. And, you know, his refrain of like his philosophy on his own poetry is that he like puts out what he gets in from the world, right? And so he gets up there but of course he he talks about how fucking everything is sad, and that you know, he doesn't really feel great about things, and to it like being immediately in tension with the audience. It's like one of the people in the back is like, "What? Sing a happy song. This is supposed to be a happy occasion. What are you doing?" And so I mean, he ends up finishing it out, and Minna's of course a wreck again. I guess for many reasons of seeing him for the first time in forever, and him basically singing a lament or a torch song for Minna. I mean, and to at least talk about the technique of the movie, and specifically how some of the musical sequences are shot. I mean, shouldn't be too surprising that a lot of it can feel like a dance or even like a ballet, but some of it feels so discontinuous and jagged that even like the push-ins like kind of feel like they hurt. Even outside of that one specific sequence I was talking about, there's one later on where VJ is, this has to be like in the back half of the movie, where he's like standing on a balcony and Gulab, there's like some concert going on below them. And like, it's of course very relevant emotional lyrics that are happening. And she's like trying to slowly get closer and closer to him as like his back's turned down this balcony. And, she wants to connect with him, even though up until that point, they've only had like kind of tense interactions of him wanting to get his poetry back from her because he doesn't, he wants to buy it back, and she bought it as like waste paper and found it as poetry and been keeping it and using it as like ways to seduce men or whatever to get them to come upstairs. And, only feels like she has pity for him, and that's not really like what he wants or what what he's looking for. And so there's this sequence towards the end where like she's really, really trying to connect to him, that it's like, it's all this discontinuous, like jagged, like getting closer and closer, but can't quite get to it. And there's like dollies in and dollies out that feel like almost like a bit of a vertigo like situation of a dance, where it's just like she keeps trying to get close, but as she does, she immediately pulls back, knowing that it probably can't be. And like just as like a point of like end characterization, that it's a hell of a sequence and really sad. And so, to your point of even, or like, to what apparently the studio wanted to do with the end, it also kind of feels weird that they end up getting together and leaving side by side at the end. I don't know if I would have felt as complicated about that if I didn't hear about the production of it, but it does leave a different tone to how they kind of leave side by side, when apparently he wanted him to just be alone at the end, away from the crowd. So, okay. Because to me at that point, their like relationship was in this, place of, disconnection, or like an asymmetry. So
any final thoughts about the movie before we wrap up? This is the first Bollywood film that we've kind of covered, so I'm curious if this should be something that we should kind of explore in the future, because I think that especially Western audiences are probably not taking the time necessarily to study the history of this type of film.
No, it definitely has me very excited to get a little more familiar with Bollywood. I think even though it's a huge problem for American and Western cinephiles, ignoring Bollywood cinema and just Indian cinema in general, I think that a lot of people at least are like familiar with the sort of pastiche kind of like contemporary Bollywood tropes. You have an image in your mind of what that looks like, and it's just like very interesting to go back a little bit and see the sort of the ancestors of that, and to see kind of the beginnings of certain styles and certain forms taking shape. So it's really interesting. I don't know, this is just like a very interesting fusion of entertainment and social realism, social commentary. And I'm very intrigued both to see more films by Guru Dutt, but just more Bollywood in general.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, we've kind of been hanging out in the 50s so far, right, with Hindi films. So I don't quite know what our next step is. Oh,
I take it back. We have a Bollywood sequence in our history, that Jackie Chan film.
Damn it, Zach!
Oh my god!
Is that not counting?
I forgot. I forgot.
Oh, it was.
It was only earlier this year, and I've forgotten. But I mean, to that point, at least, I'm ignoring you, Zach. I'm sorry.
Oh, we also have the Love Guru too. So
wait, what do we have?
We're doing the Love Guru.
Yeah.
We're doing great.
We're picking it up.
But to that point of like interesting tensions that a Bollywood movie, or at least this one, and even kind of in a more peripheral way in Satyajit Ray's movies that we've seen or talked about, is just how it's hard for me because I don't know that many languages in India. So I mean, there's Hindi and a lot of others, but it's just surprising to me. I mean, if this is supposed to be a post-independence production, right? That how many is like as a hierarchical or as a status symbol that like English gets just like injected into the movie, right? Like I mean, particularly we get a lot of it from the modern publisher guy who wears suits all the time, and just kind of almost uses English as like a bludgeon. It always feels like it gets used to like snipe at somebody. Sometimes it is as casual or, when they're in that school sequence. So, I mean, you even has like a college or education sequence where you have this teacher up there that's mostly trying to get people to speak in English and even answer to this like present in English and call people sirs and stuff that I feel like there'd be a lot of interest and value in that part of it, including the great musical sequences that it just kind of makes clear kind of a tension that I think can be easy to forget about if we don't even like start watching more Bollywood movies. So, yeah, I'm down for that.
As long as it's not including Mike Myers or Jackie Chan.
I mean,
Jackie Chan.
All right. Well, that will wrap up this episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematary, on Twitter at handle @Cinematary, and on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/Cinematary, where we put all of the movies that we talked about in this episode. Also, you can join us on Patreon. Anything kind of promoting the site and the podcast is helpful. A tweet saying, hey, we like this podcast is helpful. But if you'd like to pledge some money and help pay our writers who are doing a fantastic job on the website, please think about joining us on Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Cinematary. But we want to thank our patrons so far. Thank you, Cam, Chad Newsom, Christopher Metcalf, Eric Dukowski, Graham Jones, Harry Eskin, Maggie, Marie Barty, Matthew Lingo, Miranda Barnwall, Ron Hayes, Tyler Chandler, Whitney Rio Ross, and Will Carroll. Thank you so much for your patronage. Next week, we will be continuing our Young Critics Watch Old Movies series with 1969's Putney Swope, which should be an exciting one. It was one that got evoked a lot last year. I think it recently had a restoration done, and then was named as a big influencer for Sorry to Bother You, which was kind of a little bit of a indie conversation. So I'm excited to dig into this one and see how the better Robert Downey lives his life. But thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week.